Okay, gang. This is part one of a two-part screencast on cooperative learning. We're just going to do a little bit of an introduction. I'm sure many of you have been part of a quote-unquote group before that was given a project or a task to accomplish supposedly together, and probably experienced some people in your group who were free riders or social loafers, you know, those folks that did nothing and rode on your coattails. And a lot of times that's because the work itself was not structured effectively. The division of labor was not equitable among members of the group, and therefore you've got people who basically didn't have to do anything, and that can lead to a lot of conflict. So what we want to do if we're going to use cooperative learning effectively in our classrooms is we need to try to avoid, right, those negative components of group work. And to do that, we have to think about three things: positive interdependence, individual and group accountability, and interpersonal and small group skills. These are three fundamental things that you want to think about in order to design true cooperative learning activities for your students to participate in. Positive interdependence is actually the most important element, and it's the most difficult one. It's the hardest to do because I think sometimes we are like, oh, I'd like my students to work together. However, the task that we want them to work together on isn't necessarily one that needs more than one person. And we end up sort of shifting back to that group work structure where we have social loafers and free riders. So one thing to do when you're designing a cooperative learning activity is ask yourself these two questions. Does the success of one student benefit the other people in the group? And is everyone's contribution necessary in order for the group to be able to complete the task or solve the problem or whatever it is you're asking them to do? If you can't answer yes to both or either of these questions, then more than likely you have a quote-unquote group work design in play and not something that's going to promote true cooperation between your students. And when we do that, we tend to run into sort of the negative elements of cooperative learning much more frequently. So what are some things you can do to create positive interdependence? In other words, the kids have to work together in order to be successful. You can give each student a different role. This is, again, this is going to depend on the type of learning activity that you're having them participate in or project you're having them complete. So different roles to each student is one way to do it. You could give each student access to different materials that are needed to complete the project or solve the problem. Or kids could have access to different information. So each student, because they have something that is needed in order for the group to be successful, is needed to participate. You can also limit the time so that no one person in the group can sort of like take over and just do it, run through it, and do it real quick by themselves. So you want to do something, you want to think about time limits as a way to create positive interdependence. Another way to think about it is beyond time is to make it difficult. Like there's no way to complete it. You can't do it alone. You need others. And then you might also want to think about another way to think about positive interdependence is designing tasks with what we call cumulative contributions. So I wrote an example here to give you an idea. Sometimes we might have students design a story together as a team. And so in other words, each teammate would add a sentence to the story as it's getting passed around, or add a sentence to the summary, whatever it is, that all team members' contributions are necessary in order to create a finished product. So positive interdependence, super important for cooperative learning. The other thing that we need to ensure if it's going to be effective is individual and group accountability. And these suggestions are listed on that handout that you have in front of you. You will have a tendency when you're designing your first lessons and unit and all that fun stuff to be like, I'm going to have them work in a group of 5. I think they'll work in a group of 4. This is probably not the wisest thing to do. It will lead much more frequently to kids, being free riders and not having to do any meaningful contribution to the task, okay? So you want to keep your group small, especially if you're in a classroom where they don't typically do any sort of cooperative learning, pairs or groups of 3 at the most. You always want to make sure that each kid has a specific role or task, and then you're going to incorporate informal checks for understanding, you walking around checking to make sure that everybody in that group understands what is being learned, or what knows the answer to the quote unquote question that they're supposedly trying to construct a response to. So those are some ways, and we're going to learn some more throughout the course of social studies methods, but we want to keep that in mind, that you're not just going to give a quote unquote group grade. Always, always, always. Individual accountability. So the student will be graded on some component of this activity, project, group learning activity, whatever it is, based on their own efforts, work, what they produce, and they'll be quote unquote graded or accountable to the whole group as well. Okay, 2 grades always. And then finally, you really need to think about how you're going to help kids develop interpersonal skills they need to work effectively together. And we're going to do more with this over the course of the semester, because this is something that in social studies, learning how to work together in a democracy is one of our primary goals as social studies educators. So we're going to spend some time thinking about how we can help kids have conversations about controversial issues and things that might typically lead to a lot of conflict and resentment sometimes even, but ways in which we can teach them how to talk to each other so we don't end up down that path. So this is the end of part 1. Was just to give you a little tease, if you will, for cooperative learning, and kind of hopefully help you wrap your brain around the fact that it's a little more difficult than it might appear. Okay.